The convoy arrived in late afternoon when shadows stretched long across the compound. Mud-caked vehicles groaned to a halt outside the wire, engines sputtering into silence. The women inside sat rigid against wooden benches, their bodies swaying with the final lurch of the trucks. They wore uniforms that had once been crisp and proper, but weeks of retreat had left the fabric creased and stained. Their boots showed wear at the heels, dust clung to their collars. Still, they held their chins high, refusing to let exhaustion show in their faces. Pride was all they had left to wear. The gates creaked open slowly, metal scraping against metal. The women braced themselves for what they had been taught to expect. Harsh commands, brutal efficiency, perhaps violence. Their instructors had painted vivid pictures of enemy soldiers, described them as ruthless and organized, machines of war without mercy. But when the women climbed down from the trucks, blinking in the slanted light, what they encountered was nothing like those warnings. American soldiers stood scattered around the yard in poses that seemed almost careless. Rifles hung loosely from shoulders. Helmets sat at crooked angles. One young man had his sleeves pushed up past his elbows, revealing tanned forearms marked with old scars and freckles. Another leaned his weight against his weapon as though it were nothing more than a walking stick. A third worked his jaw steadily, chewing something that created a small rhythmic motion in his cheek. He blew a bubble that expanded pink and translucent before bursting with a sound like a small firecracker. The women stared. This display of informality seemed impossible. These were the conquerors? These slouching boys with their casual grins and rolled-up sleeves? The women had been drilled in military precision their entire adult lives. They understood hierarchy, order, the sharp edges of discipline. What stood before them now looked more like a gathering of farm labourers than an army. Someone laughed. It started as a single snicker from the back of the group, then spread like a wave. The sound was sharp and bitter, edged with disbelief. A woman near the front whispered in German, nodding toward the guard whose helmet tilted so far back it seemed ready to slide off his head. Another pointed out the mismatched boots on a tall soldier standing by the fence. The laughter grew louder, emboldened by confusion. They had expected monsters and found instead what looked like children playing dress-up in oversized uniforms. The mockery felt good, felt powerful. It gave them back a piece of control they thought they had lost. The Americans noticed. How could they not? But their reactions were puzzling. No one shouted. No one struck back with anger. A few guards glanced at each other with raised eyebrows, seemingly amused rather than offended. One even smiled, a sheepish expression that suggested he understood how ridiculous they must appear. This lack of response only deepened the women's confusion. Where was the fury? Where was the iron discipline? Their own officers would have responded to such disrespect with immediate punishment, but these men simply continued their tasks, unbothered, as though laughter was of no consequence. A young nurse with dark brown hair studied the scene carefully. She was perhaps 20 years old, her face still soft with youth despite everything she had witnessed. She watched a guard stumble slightly on uneven ground, his boots catching on an exposed root. More laughter erupted around her. Women elbowed each other, pointing, making jokes in rapid German. But beneath her own forced smile, the nurse felt something else stirring. Uncertainty. These men did not behave like enemies. They did not behave like soldiers at all. They moved with an ease that seemed foreign, almost innocent. One scratched the back of his neck absently. Another yawned without covering his mouth. Such small gestures, yet they spoke of something the women had rarely encountered among their own ranks. Humanity. Casualness. The absence of fear. As the sun dipped lower, the women were directed toward their quarters. Guards gestured with open palms, rather than barked orders. The march to the barracks felt more like a guided walk than a forced movement. Inside the long wooden building, the air smelled of fresh sawdust and harsh soap. Bunks lined both walls, simple frames with thin mattresses that looked clean despite their plainness. A small window at the far end offered a view of the yard where guards had begun to gather in loose clusters. Through the glass, the women could see them sharing cigarettes, passing a canteen back and forth. Their voices drifted through the evening air, punctuated by easy laughter. The women settled onto their bunks, exchanging looks of bewilderment. Some continued their mockery, voices low but cutting. They called the guards overgrown children, amateurs, boys pretending at war. But others had fallen quiet, their eyes distant. The dark-haired nurse lay back on her bunk, staring up at rough wooden beams that crossed the ceiling. She could still hear the Americans outside, their conversation rising and falling like gentle waves. There was no edge to their voices, no threat. Just the sound of young men at ease with one another. She closed her eyes and tried to make sense of what she had witnessed. No beatings, no cruelty, not even harsh words, just patience and that strange, unsettling casualness. Her instructors had prepared her for many things, but not for this, not for enemies who smiled, not for conquerors who seemed more interested in their card games than in asserting dominance. The laughter around her had quieted now, replaced by whispered conversations that carried less conviction than before. Someone muttered about how soft the Americans were, how unfit for real warfare, but the words sounded hollow, as though spoken more from habit than belief. The nurse turned on her side, pulling the rough blanket over her shoulder. Through the window she could still see the glow of cigarettes in the darkness, could still hear fragments of conversation. One guard laughed at something, a sound so genuine and carefree it made her chest tighten with an emotion she could not identify. She had expected to find brutality here. She had steeled herself for degradation, for the kind of treatment she had been told to anticipate. Instead, she found herself lying in a clean bunk, listening to men who sounded like they were discussing nothing more serious than tomorrow's weather. Her heart beat faster as a specific memory surfaced. One of the guards, the one with freckles scattered across his nose and cheeks, had looked at her as she passed. Not with hatred or contempt, not with the leering hunger she had sometimes seen in town squares before the war. His eyes had been blue, bright and clear in the afternoon light, and in them she had seen something that frightened her more than anger ever could. Curiosity, simple human interest. He had looked at her as though seeing another person, not an enemy, not a symbol, but just a woman standing in the dust. She pressed her face into the thin pillow, whispering to herself. Fools. They are nothing but fools. The words were meant to restore her certainty, to rebuild the walls that had begun to crack. But even as she spoke them, she knew they rang false. Her pulse had quickened when those blue eyes met hers. Some part of her, a part she desperately wanted to deny, had registered that glance as something dangerous. Not dangerous in the way a weapon is dangerous, but in the way a spark near kindling is dangerous. It promised something that could spread if given the chance. Around her, the other women had begun to settle into uneasy sleep. Their breathing grew slower, more regular, but underneath the rhythm of rest, the nurse sensed the same confusion that plagued her own thoughts. They had all arrived expecting one version of captivity and found another. They had prepared themselves for monsters and discovered instead young men who seemed almost gentle in their indifference to mockery. That discovery had shaken something fundamental. If the enemy was not cruel, then what did that mean about everything they had been taught? What did it mean about the war itself, about the cause they had served, about the future that awaited them? The night deepened. The voices outside gradually faded. But sleep would not come easily for the dark-haired nurse. She lay awake in the darkness, her mind turning over the events of the day like pages in a book she could not put down. Somewhere in the yard, a guard coughed. Another said something in English, the words incomprehensible, but the tone warm and friendly. The nurse squeezed her eyes shut and tried to force her thoughts into submission. But unbidden, the image of those blue eyes returned. She saw again that moment of connection, brief as a heartbeat, when two human beings had acknowledged each other across the divide of war. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself she was simply tired, confused, overwhelmed by the strangeness of captivity. But deep down, in a place she dared not examine too closely, a small voice whispered a different truth. Something had begun today. Something that started with laughter meant as a shield but was already transforming into something else. Curiosity, wonder, perhaps even the first fragile threads of something that might, in time, grow into longing. The women had come here as prisoners, expecting to find their worst fears confirmed. Instead, they had found their assumptions challenged. And that challenge, that crack in the certainty they had carried like armour, would prove more dangerous than any cruelty could have been. Morning arrived with the harsh clang of a metal bell swung by a guard near the main building. The sound cut through the early mist, pulling the women from restless sleep. They rose slowly, their bodies stiff from the unfamiliar bunks, and assembled in the yard for roll call. The sun had not yet cleared the eastern fence, and the air held a cool dampness that made them pull their thin jackets tighter. They formed rough lines, standing with backs straight despite their exhaustion, faces set in expressions of defiant pride. The guards moved along the rows with clipboards, checking names against typed lists. One soldier had his helmet pushed so far back on his head it revealed a shock of red hair. Another moved with a slight limp, favouring his left leg. The women noticed these imperfections and seized upon them like weapons. Whispers passed down the lines in German, too quick for the Americans to catch. Someone made a joke about the red-haired guard's appearance, comparing him to a rooster. Another snickered at the limping soldier, suggesting he must have tripped over his own feet. The laughter rippled through the group again, but it had changed subtly from the previous day. It came faster now, more forced, as though they were trying to convince themselves of something they no longer quite believed. The guards continued their work without reaction. When one overheard the laughter, he simply glanced up and offered a small smile, as if acknowledging that yes, they must indeed look somewhat absurd. This response unsettled the women more than anger would have. Anger they understood. Anger was familiar territory where battle lines were clear. But this patient indifference, this refusal to engage with their mockery, left them grasping at air. What kind of soldiers were these who would not defend their own dignity? The dark-haired nurse stood in the second row, her arms crossed over her chest. She kept her eyes forward, trying not to look at the guards directly. But she could feel their presence, could sense the freckled one moving somewhere behind her with his clipboard. Her skin prickled with awareness. When he passed close enough that she could hear his boots in the gravel, her breath caught involuntarily. She scolded herself silently for the reaction, but her body refused to obey her mind's commands. Some part of her was hyper-aware of his proximity, tracking his movement through the yard like a compass needle finding north. After roll call, the women were directed to the camp kitchens. The building sat near the centre of the compound, a long structure with screened windows that let out clouds of steam and the mingled scents of cooking food. As they approached, the smell of bacon hit them first, rich and fatty, followed by the sharp aroma of coffee. One woman made a show of disgust, pressing her hand to her nose and announcing loudly in German that this was the garbage Americans called food. Others laughed, but the sound was thin, unconvincing. Their stomachs betrayed them with audible growls. Inside the kitchen, guards stood behind long tables laden with trays. They scooped portions of scrambled eggs, thick slices of bread, strips of bacon onto metal plates. The women filed through, accepting their meals with studied indifference, as though the food meant nothing to them. But once seated at the rough wooden benches, pretense crumbled before hunger. They ate quickly, heads bent over their plates, savouring the warmth and substance of the meal despite themselves. The bread was fresh, the eggs were seasoned with pepper and salt, and the bacon, however much they wanted to disdain it, tasted better than anything they had eaten in weeks. One guard noticed their rapid consumption and allowed himself a small smile. He said nothing, made no comment, but that silent observation carried more weight than words. The women felt it like a judgment, gentle but unmistakable. They were transparent. Their pretense was fooling no one. Heat crept into their cheeks, shame mixing with resentment. They wanted to maintain their dignity, to show contempt for everything American, but their own hunger had exposed the lie. Some tried to slow down, to eat more carefully, but the damage was done. They had revealed their need, and in doing so had given their captors a small victory. After breakfast, work assignments were distributed. The women were divided into groups for various tasks around the camp. Some would work in the laundry, others in the gardens, still others would assist with general cleaning and maintenance. The assignments were delivered not as punishments, but as simple necessities, explained in broken German by guards who consulted small pocket dictionaries to find the right words. The women accepted their duties silently, unsure how to respond to this business-like approach. Where was the forced labour they had expected? Where were the brutal overseers? The dark-haired nurse found herself assigned to the medical supply room, a small building where bandages, medicines and equipment were stored. She was tasked with organising inventory, checking expiration dates and keeping the shelves orderly. A guard unlocked the door for her, then stepped back to let her enter first. The gesture was so automatic, so ingrained that she nearly missed its significance. He had opened the door for her, as though she were a guest rather than a prisoner. The realization made her pause on the threshold, confusion flickering across her face. The guard noticed her hesitation and raised his eyebrows questioningly, clearly unsure if something was wrong. She shook her head quickly and stepped inside, but her hands were trembling as she set to work. Throughout the morning, small interactions continued to chip away at the women's certainty. A prisoner struggling with a heavy bucket of water was surprised when an American guard simply walked over and took one handle, carrying it with her to its destination without a word. No command had been given, no permission asked. He had simply helped, as though the action required no thought at all. The women exchanged glances, their minds struggling to process this behaviour. In their experience, soldiers did not help. They ordered, they demanded, they expected obedience, but they did not share burdens. By midday, the heat had grown oppressive. The women were given a break and gathered in the shade of their barracks, passing around a bucket of water with a shared ladle. Their conversations had lost much of their earlier bite. Some still made half-hearted attempts at mockery, but the words fell flat. Others sat in silence, staring at the ground or the distant fence line. One woman, a clerk who had worked in administrative offices before her capture, spoke what many were thinking. "I do not understand them," she said quietly. "They do not behave like soldiers. They do not even behave like men I have known. They are something different." The comment hung in the air, unchallenged, because it was true. These Americans did not fit any category the women had been given. They were not cruel enough to be villains, not formal enough to be proper military men, not distant enough to remain faceless enemies. They were just young men doing their jobs with a casualness that seemed almost civilian. They laughed at themselves. They helped without being asked. They showed patience when mocked. These qualities did not align with anything the women had been taught about the enemy, and the disconnect created a space where doubt could grow. That evening, as the sun began its descent and the heat finally broke, the women returned to their barracks. They washed in cold water from a communal basin, changed into the simple nightdresses they had been issued, and settled onto their bunks. Through the window, they could see the guards gathering outside their own quarters. Someone had started a small fire in a metal drum, and the men stood around it, warming their hands despite the lingering heat of the day. One pulled out a harmonica, and soon notes began to drift across the compound. The melody was simple, something that sounded like a folk tune, played with more enthusiasm than skill. The women listened without speaking. Some lay with their eyes closed, letting the music wash over them. Others stared at the ceiling or the wall, their expressions unreadable. The dark-haired nurse sat on the edge of her bunk, her arms wrapped around her knees, watching the fire's glow through the small window. She could see silhouettes moving against the flames, could hear the low murmur of conversation between musical phrases. One guard threw his head back and laughed at something, the sound carrying clearly in the still air. It was not mocking laughter. It was not cruel. It was simply the sound of someone genuinely amused, sharing joy with companions. She pressed her forehead against the rough wood of the wall, feeling its grain against her skin. The sound of that laughter did something to her, created a sensation in her chest that was both painful and oddly sweet. It reminded her of evenings before the war, of gatherings where people were simply people, not soldiers or enemies or symbols of nations. It reminded her that human beings were capable of lightness, of joy unconnected to ideology or duty. And that reminder felt dangerous because it made her wonder about the lives these Americans had left behind. What had the freckled guard done before the war? Had he worked a farm, his hands learning their steadiness from milking cows or repairing fences? Had he gone to school, played sports, fallen in love? The questions buzzed in her mind like insects, impossible to swat away. Around her, other women were beginning to whisper. The conversations were different now, softer, more hesitant. Someone admitted that the food had been good, better than they wanted to acknowledge. Another mentioned the guard who had helped with the bucket, noting that his hands had been gentle, careful not to let the water slosh. A third woman spoke about overhearing Americans singing earlier in the day, their voices blending in harmony that suggested practice, familiarity, friendship. These observations were offered tentatively, as though testing dangerous ground. One woman asked the question that had been forming in all their minds: why do they not hate us? The query was met with silence, because none of them had an answer. Logic suggested that Americans should resent German prisoners, should treat them with the hardness of victors dealing with the defeated. But instead, they encountered something closer to indifference mixed with occasional kindness. It made no sense. Unless, the dark-haired nurse thought, but did not say aloud, unless they do not see us as the enemy, unless they see us as we are seeing them now, as people caught in circumstances not of our making. The thought was too large, too frightening to speak. It suggested a world where the neat categories of friend and enemy dissolved into something far more complicated. It suggested that perhaps the men who had conquered them were not so different from the brothers and fathers and friends they had lost. And if that were true, then what did it mean about everything that had happened? What did it mean about the war, about the ideology they had served, about the future stretching ahead of them? The harmonica played on, its notes simple and sweet. The fire crackled. Male voices rose and fell in easy conversation. And inside the barracks, German women lay in the darkness, each wrestling with thoughts she could share with no one, not even herself. The laughter that had started as mockery had given way to confusion. And confusion was slowly, inexorably, beginning to give way to something else. Something that felt like the first trembling edges of understanding, of recognition, of seeing the human face behind the uniform and finding it not monstrous at all, but terribly dangerously ordinary. The nurse finally lay down, pulling her thin blanket up to her chin. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was of blue eyes meeting hers across the dusty yard. Eyes that had not shown hatred or triumph, but only a quiet, acknowledging awareness. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself she would forget by morning. But even as sleep overtook her, she knew she was lying. That moment had burned itself into her memory, and it would not fade. If anything, it would only grow brighter with time. The second week in the camp brought a settling of routines that made the days blur together. Wake to the bell. Roll call in the yard. Breakfast in the mess, work assignments scattered throughout the compound, midday rest, more work, evening meal, return to the barracks. The repetition created a strange sense of normalcy, as though this had always been their life and would always continue. But beneath the surface of routine, changes were occurring in ways both subtle and profound. The women no longer laughed openly at the guards. The mockery that had seemed so important in those first days had evaporated like morning dew. Instead, they watched. They observed. They noticed things they had not bothered to see before. The way one guard always double-checked the locks, his fingers running over each mechanism with practiced care. The way another hummed while he worked, the same melody over and over as though it brought him comfort. The way a third had a habit of touching his pocket where a photograph was presumably kept, his expression softening each time his fingers found that small square of paper. These observations were gathered like treasures, hoarded in the privacy of individual thoughts. The women did not discuss them openly during the day, but at night, when darkness provided cover and loosened tongues, whispers began to circulate. "Did you notice how the tall one always saves the corner pieces of bread for the last woman in line? Did you see that the redhead carved something on the fence post near the laundry? Someone claimed to have seen a guard leave extra soap on a windowsill, a small gift offered without acknowledgement. These tiny gestures took on enormous significance, analysed and reanalysed until they became like scripture, full of possible meanings and interpretations. The dark-haired nurse found herself increasingly aware of the freckled guard's movements throughout the camp. She did not seek him out deliberately, she told herself. It was merely that her eyes happened to find him in any crowd. She noticed when he was on duty near the medical supply room where she worked. She registered when he passed by the window. She tracked his voice among the others during evening gatherings. This awareness both thrilled and terrified her. She had no name for what she was feeling, no framework for understanding why the sight of him should make her pulse quicken or her hands grow unsteady. One afternoon she was hanging laundry on lines strung between posts in the yard. Other women worked alongside her, lifting wet sheets and pinning them with wooden clips. The work was mindless, repetitive, allowing thoughts to wander. The freckled guard walked past, heading toward the main gate on some errand. As he passed, he glanced in her direction. Their eyes met for perhaps 2 seconds. He nodded slightly, a small acknowledgement, and before she could stop herself, before her mind could intervene with caution or fear, she smiled back. It was the smallest expression, barely more than a softening of her mouth. But the effect was immediate and overwhelming. Her heart began to race. Heat flooded her face. Her hands, holding a damp shirt, began to shake so badly she nearly dropped it. She turned quickly, pretending to adjust a clothespin, hoping no one had noticed. But inside, she felt as though something fundamental had shifted. She had responded. She had smiled at the enemy. She had acknowledged the connection that had been building in glances and unspoken awareness. And now there was no taking it back. The guard continued walking, but she sensed a change in his gait, a slight hesitation that suggested he too had felt the significance of that exchange. He did not look back, but his shoulders seemed to straighten, his pace to quicken slightly. He had noticed. He knew. The knowledge settled over her like a blanket, equal parts warmth and weight. That night, the whispers in the barracks took on a new intensity. Women spoke more freely now, emboldened by darkness and the sense that they were all sharing in something forbidden. One confessed that she had dreamed of a guard offering her wildflowers gathered from beyond the fence. Another admitted she caught herself staring at a soldier's hands, noticing their shape, their strength, the way they moved with surprising grace for their size. These confessions were met not with mockery, but with understanding nods. They were all experiencing something similar, all feeling the pull of attraction despite every reason to resist it. The clerk who had questioned the guard's behaviour spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. What if they think of us the same way we think of them? The question hung in the air like smoke. No one answered immediately. The possibility was too large, too dangerous to contemplate fully. But it planted seeds that would grow in the darkness, feeding on hope and fear in equal measure. The dark-haired nurse lay silent during these exchanges, contributing nothing to the conversation. But inside, her mind was a storm of thoughts she could not control. Did he think of her the way she thought of him? When he nodded, when he smiled, was it merely politeness, or did it carry weight? Did he lie awake at night the way she did, replaying small moments and searching them for meaning? The questions had no answers, but they consumed her attention like fire-consuming paper. Outside, the usual sounds of the American camp filtered through the walls, voices raised in conversation, occasional laughter, the clink of metal cups against metal plates. And then, as had become customary, the harmonica began to play. Tonight the melody was slower, more contemplative, almost melancholy. The notes seemed to carry longing, as though the musician was playing out feelings too complex for words. The women fell silent, listening. Some closed their eyes. Others stared at the ceiling or the dark shapes of the bunks across from them. The music seeped into the barracks like water finding every crack and crevice. It filled the spaces between heartbeats, accompanied the rhythm of breathing, underscored the unspoken thoughts that crowded every mind. The dark-haired nurse felt tears prick at her eyes, though she could not have said exactly why. The music was beautiful and sad, hopeful and resigned all at once. It spoke of distance that could not be crossed, of desires that could not be fulfilled, of two worlds separated by barriers far stronger than barbed wire. And yet it also spoke of the possibility of connection, of the stubborn human need to reach across divides and touch another soul, even when such touch was forbidden. When the music finally ended, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. The women lay in their bunks, each alone with thoughts that were somehow all the same. They were prisoners of war, captured by an enemy they had been taught to hate. But hatred required distance, required seeing the other as less than human. And distance had become impossible to maintain when they saw their captors laugh and stumble, help and hesitate, when they heard their music and recognized in it the same longing that filled their own hearts. Sleep came slowly that night. The dark-haired nurse turned onto her side, drawing her knees up and wrapping her arms around them. She thought of the smile she had given, that small act of acknowledgement that felt like a betrayal of everything she had been raised to believe. But it had also felt true, more honest than anything she had done in months. She had seen another human being and had responded as one human to another, stripped of politics and ideology and national identity. Just two people in a dusty yard, recognizing each other across a space that was supposed to be unbridgeable. Tomorrow there would be more work, more routine, more careful distance. But something had changed irreversibly. The barrier had been breached, if only in the smallest way. A smile had been offered and received. And in the economy of human connection, such gestures carried weight far beyond their apparent simplicity. They were the first words in a conversation that would grow more complex and dangerous with each passing day. They were the sparks that, given enough time and enough air, could grow into flames that would consume caution and transform lives in ways none of them could yet imagine. The women drifted towards sleep, their breathing gradually synchronizing into the rhythm of rest. But dreams waited for them. Dreams they had not invited but could not prevent. Dreams of hands that were gentle rather than harsh, of voices that were kind rather than commanding, of futures that diverged wildly from anything they had been promised or prepared for. And in those dreams, the lines between prisoner and guard blurred until they became only man and woman, only two souls reaching toward each other across the darkness, drawn by forces older and stronger than any war. By the third week, the transformation was undeniable. The women moved through their days with a new awareness that coloured everything they did. Work assignments that had once seemed like drudgery now became opportunities for proximity. The chance to pass near a particular guard while carrying laundry. The possibility of catching a certain smile during the afternoon water distribution. Every mundane task held potential for connection, however brief. The guards, for their part, seemed increasingly aware of the women as individuals rather than an anonymous mass of prisoners. They began to remember names, though they were careful not to use them too familiarly. They noticed when someone seemed unwell or when work proved too taxing. Small adjustments were made. A heavier load redistributed. Extra time allowed for a difficult task. These considerations were offered quietly, without fanfare, but the women registered every one. One morning, a young prisoner named Greta was struggling with a crate of supplies, her arms trembling under the weight. An American guard approached, not with commands, but with action. He simply took the opposite end of the crate and helped her carry it to the storage building. They worked in silence, navigating the uneven ground together. When they set the crate down, he met her eyes briefly and offered a small smile. She nodded in acknowledgement, her cheeks flushing pink. The entire interaction lasted perhaps 30 seconds, yet it would fuel whispered conversations for days. The dark-haired nurse continued her work in the medical supply room, her days structured around counting bandages and organizing bottles of antiseptic. The freckled guard had taken to checking on the supply room more frequently than seemed strictly necessary. He would appear at the door, ostensibly to ask about inventory levels or to deliver new stock, but these visits often stretched longer than their purpose required. He would lean against the doorframe, making small talk in broken German supplemented with hand gestures. She would respond in equally halting English, both of them fumbling through conversations about weather and work and nothing in particular. During one such visit, he asked her name. The question caught her off guard, and for a moment she forgot herself entirely. "Maria," she said before she could think better of it. He repeated it, his pronunciation careful, his tongue working around the unfamiliar sounds. "Maria." She nodded, a small smile escaping despite her attempts at restraint. "And you?" she asked, the English words feeling foreign in her mouth. "Thomas," he replied. His freckles seemed more pronounced when he smiled. "Tom." The exchange of names felt momentous, like a treaty signed between warring nations. They were no longer prisoner and guard, no longer generic representatives of opposing sides. They were Maria and Tom, two people who had been given their own identities back. The knowledge sat between them, acknowledged but not discussed. After he left, Maria stood alone in the supply room, her hand pressed against her chest where her heart hammered against her ribs. She had given him her name. He had given his in return. The simple act felt simultaneously innocent and wildly dangerous, a step toward connection that could not easily be reversed. That evening, the women gathered in their usual spots after the day's work concluded. The conversations that had once centered on food and fatigue now turned almost exclusively to the guards. They spoke of observations made during the day, of small kindnesses noticed, of looks that might have meant something. The tone was different from earlier weeks, less mocking, less bitter. Now there was a softness in their voices, a vulnerability they would have once denied. Someone asked if anyone had learned any of the guards' names. Several hands went up hesitantly. One woman knew the tall guard was called James. Another had discovered the redhead answered to Patrick. Maria remained silent, hoarding the knowledge of Tom's name like a secret too precious to share. To speak it aloud would make it real in a way she was not yet ready to confront. The clerk with administrative experience spoke thoughtfully. "They see us," she said, "not as enemies, as women." The statement was met with nods of agreement. It was true. The guards had begun to differentiate between prisoners, to recognize individuals, to respond to personality and character, rather than simply processing a homogeneous group. This recognition was both validating and terrifying. To be seen meant to be vulnerable. To be known meant to risk caring whether one was liked or disliked, accepted or rejected. As darkness fell and the women prepared for sleep, the familiar sound of the harmonica drifted across the compound. The tune tonight was livelier, almost playful, with quick notes that danced and tumbled over each other. Outside the Americans' quarters, shadows moved against firelight. Voices were raised in song, rough but enthusiastic, harmonizing on a chorus that repeated several times. The women listened from their bunks, some with eyes closed, others staring toward the window where yellow light flickered against the darkness. Maria lay on her back, her blanket pulled up to her chin. She could pick out Tom's voice among the others, though she could not understand the English words he sang. His voice was pleasant, on key, slightly hesitant, as though he was not entirely confident in his singing, but was willing to try anyway. The sound of it made something warm unfurl in her chest, a sensation that was equal parts pleasure and pain. She thought about the way his freckles moved when he smiled, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, the way his hands had gestured as he tried to explain something in German earlier that day. She was falling into dangerous territory, she knew. This was not simple attraction or idle fantasy. This was the beginning of real feeling, the kind that could not be easily dismissed or controlled. Every interaction with Tom reinforced it, added layers of depth and complexity. She was learning who he was, beyond the uniform. She was starting to care about him as a person. And caring was the most dangerous thing she could do. Around her, other women were grappling with similar realizations. Some turned their faces into their pillows, as though physical darkness could block out the thoughts that plagued them. Others lay still, eyes open, staring at nothing while their minds raced. They were all crossing invisible lines, moving from simple acknowledgement towards something far more profound. The whispers had stopped for tonight, but the silence was heavy with unspoken understanding. They were all experiencing variations of the same forbidden journey. When the singing outside finally ended, replaced by the low murmur of conversation and the sounds of men preparing for sleep, Maria found herself straining to hear Tom's voice one last time. She caught fragments of his laughter, the particular rhythm of his speech even when she could not understand the words. Eventually, the camp settled into quiet. Guards on watch moved between posts. Small sounds of wildlife emerged from beyond the fence. The world continued its rotation, indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding within this temporary enclosure. Maria closed her eyes and tried to force her mind towards sleep, but unbidden, a fantasy rose in her imagination. She saw herself and Tom in a different context, a different world. No barbed wire, no war. Just a chance meeting in some peaceful place where their nationalities did not matter. Perhaps a park or a village square. He would smile that same smile, freckles dancing across his nose. She would respond with laughter instead of careful reserve. They would talk easily, without the burden of broken language and impossible circumstances. They would simply be two young people discovering each other, free to explore whatever might develop between them. The fantasy was painful in its impossibility. It showed her what could have been if the world were different, if history had taken another path, if they had been born into different times. But the world was not different. History had unfolded as it had. And she was a German prisoner while he was an American guard, and between them lay a chasm of politics and protocol that seemed unbridgeable. Yet even as she acknowledged the impossibility, another part of her mind whispered a different truth. They had already bridged part of that chasm. They had exchanged names. They had smiled. They had found ways to communicate despite language barriers. Small bridges, perhaps, but bridges nonetheless. And if small bridges could be built, what prevented larger ones from following? The thought was seductive and terrifying in equal measure. It suggested that the future might not be entirely determined by the past, that individual choice might matter even in circumstances that seemed to offer no choice at all. It suggested that she and Tom were not merely pieces moved by forces beyond their control, but active participants in a story still being written. She turned onto her side, facing the wall, her hand curled beneath her cheek. Tomorrow she would see him again, would hear his voice, would perhaps find new excuses to extend their brief conversations. Tomorrow the dangerous dance would continue, each small step taking her further from the safe shore of emotional distance and closer to waters where she might drown. But she knew with a certainty that both comforted and frightened her that she would take those steps anyway. because something in her had awakened, something that demanded to be felt regardless of consequence. And once awakened, such feelings could not be returned to sleep through will alone. The fourth week brought subtle changes in the camp's atmosphere. The guards seemed more relaxed around the prisoners, less formal in their interactions. Laughter came more easily. Small jokes were exchanged, mostly through gestures when language failed. The women, in turn, had shed most of their defensive posturing. They no longer felt the need to prove their superiority through mockery. Instead, they moved through their days with a quiet watchfulness, observing and absorbing and slowly allowing themselves to feel things they had been trained to suppress. Maria's work in the supply room had expanded. She was now trusted to manage orders and coordinate with other parts of the camp medical system. This meant more interaction with various guards, but particularly with Tom, who seemed to have appointed himself her primary liaison. He would arrive each morning with manifests and requisition forms, and they would review them together, their heads bent over paperwork, shoulders nearly touching. During these sessions, they talked. The conversations had moved beyond weather and work to more personal territory. Tom told her about his home, a small farm in Pennsylvania where his family grew corn and raised dairy cows. He described his younger sister, his mother's cooking, his father's strict but fair approach to discipline. Maria listened, storing every detail, building a picture of his life before the war. In turn, she told him about her own childhood, her training as a nurse, her love of music and reading. They spoke carefully, avoiding topics too painful or politically charged, but within those boundaries they found surprising common ground. One afternoon, Tom brought her a small gift. It was nothing elaborate, just a pencil sketch he had done during his off hours. The drawing showed the view from the supply room window, the yard with its scattered buildings and the fence line beyond. The technique was amateur but sincere, each line placed with care. Maria held the paper gently, as though it might dissolve at rough touch. "Why?" she asked, looking up at him with confusion and something that might have been joy. He shrugged, suddenly awkward, his freckles disappearing behind a flush that coloured his whole face. "Thought you might like it," he mumbled. "Something to remember." "Remember what?" she wanted to ask. "This place? This time? You?" But the words stuck in her throat, too heavy with implication to speak aloud. Instead, she simply smiled and thanked him, her fingers trembling slightly as she carefully folded the sketch and tucked it into her pocket. That evening, the women noticed a change in Maria. She moved through her routine tasks with a distracted air, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. During their nightly gathering, someone finally asked directly if something had happened. Maria hesitated, then pulled out the folded sketch. She unfolded it carefully, holding it up so the others could see. The reaction was immediate. Some women leaned forward, studying the drawing with interest. Others exchanged knowing glances. A few smiled softly, recognizing what the gift represented. "He drew this for you," one woman stated, her tone a mix of wonder and concern. Maria nodded, unable to deny what was obvious to everyone. The drawing was not just a casual gesture. It was an offering, a declaration of sorts. It said that Tom had thought about her during his private hours, had spent time creating something specifically for her, had wanted to give her something that would last beyond their daily encounters. It was, in the language of wartime, practically a love letter. The women discussed this development in hushed voices. Some expressed worry about the potential consequences if the relationship progressed further. Others felt a vicarious thrill, living through Maria's experience with romantic feelings they harboured for guards of their own. A few offered practical advice, suggesting ways Maria might encourage or discourage further attention depending on her own desires. But beneath all the words lay a shared understanding. They were witnessing something that went beyond simple attraction. This was developing into genuine affection, perhaps even love, between two people who by all rights should have remained strangers or enemies. As the week continued, other relationships began to surface more openly. The young prisoner Greta, who had been helped with the crate, had struck up a tentative friendship with the guard who had assisted her. They could often be seen working in proximity, finding excuses to collaborate on tasks. Another woman, a former secretary named Helga, had developed a rapport with the guard called James, their conversations growing longer and more animated each day, despite significant language barriers. The camp was transforming into something neither side had anticipated. What had begun as a standard prisoner of war arrangement was evolving into a community where human connections were forming across enemy lines. The guards and prisoners were no longer abstract categories, but individuals who knew each other's names, recognized each other's voices, understood each other's habits and preferences. This familiarity bred not contempt, but its opposite: understanding, empathy, and in some cases, affection that was growing harder to disguise or deny. The American commanders noticed the shift and grew uneasy. Unofficial warnings were issued to the guards about maintaining professional distance. Fraternization was discouraged through pointed reminders of military regulations. But enforcing such rules proved difficult when violations took the form of extended conversations, shared smiles, and small kindnesses that technically broke no explicit policy. The guards responded to these warnings with nods and affirmatives, then continued largely as before, perhaps with slightly more discretion but no less feeling. For Maria, the drawing remained her most precious possession. She kept it folded in her pocket during the day and placed it under her pillow at night. Sometimes she would take it out and study Tom's lines, imagining his hand moving across the paper, picturing his expression as he worked. The drawing was a connection to him that existed independent of their actual encounters, a tangible proof that she existed in his thoughts beyond their face-to-face interactions. One evening, after a particularly long conversation in the supply room, Tom did something unexpected. As he prepared to leave, he reached out and gently touched her hand where it rested on the counter between them. The contact lasted only a second before he pulled away, his face flushing that now familiar red. But that 1 second changed everything. His skin had been warm, slightly rough from work, unmistakably real. The touch confirmed what 100 glances had suggested. This was not imaginary or one-sided. He felt it too, whatever it was that pulsed between them. Maria stood frozen after he left, staring at the place where her hand had been, as though his fingerprints might still be visible on her skin. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. The supply room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. She sat down quickly, afraid her legs might not support her. A touch. He had touched her. Not accidentally, not in the course of necessary interaction, but deliberately, as a gesture of connection. And she had not pulled away. She had remained still, accepting it, her own skin singing where his had made contact. That night, she could barely sleep. The memory of his touch replayed endlessly, her nerves remembering the sensation with perfect clarity. Around her, the other women slept or pretended to sleep, but Maria lay awake in the darkness, her whole being focused on that one moment of physical contact. It had been the briefest possible touch, yet it carried the weight of confession. They could no longer pretend this was simple friendliness or boredom-driven conversation. Something real was growing between them, something that demanded acknowledgement even as it remained unspoken. The barriers were crumbling faster now. What had started as cracks were becoming gaps, then openings, then clear pathways where connection could flow freely. The question was no longer whether feelings existed, but what would be done about them. And that question had no easy answer, no clear path forward that would not involve risk and possible heartbreak. But for Maria, lying in her bunk with her hand curled against her chest, the risk seemed worth taking. Because the alternative, returning to the emotional numbness that had protected her before, now felt like a kind of death. She had been awakened, and sleep was no longer possible.